Before I came on this evening, I was looking at, as I'm sure many of you have been watching, the fires in the Tahoe area, and just really, remembering for myself also the orange sky that we had here in the Bay Area, not too long ago, and the feeling that very well may be for us again this year, and looking at the floods that are happening in various areas, and really knowing that, what is happening on the planet, all of these are the result of a lot of human actions of greed, and really the impact on all of us, and also disproportionately on communities of color, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color are disproportionately impacted by the environment and all of the intensities that are happening. And so tonight I wanted to offer some teachings from an ecological perspective. And my puppy would rather that I was out doing something else right now, it appears. Here you go. We'll have a commercial break. All right, there we are. So anyhow, this is what I actually want to talk about, because I want to talk about disconnection and connection. And my connection with this beloved being, Flora, is really one of the wonderful things about my life. And so what I'd like to start off is sharing a quote from Joanna Macy. Many of you are familiar with the work of Joanna Macy, who is a Buddhist scholar, a systems theorist, a deep ecologist, an elder here in the Bay Area. And her work has taken her all over the world. And one of the ways that she got started was working in the area around Chernobyl after the nuclear accident there, the disaster in 1986. And one of the books she's very well known for, and I think it was just reprinted, is World is Lover, World is Self. And so Joanna Macy says, and this is a quote that's a little dense, and I'll unpack it. She says, the crisis that threatens our planet, whether seen from its military, ecological, or social aspect, derives from a dysfunctional and pathological notion of the self. It derives from a mistake about our place and the order of things. It is a delusion that the self is so separate and fragile that we must delineate and defend its boundaries, that it is so small and so needy that we must endlessly acquire and endlessly consume, and that it is so aloof that as individuals, corporations, nation states, or species, we can be immune to what we do to other beings. So I wanted to use this quote to really pull it apart, to think about these notions of self, as Joanna presents it here, within this planetary schema, and explore a little bit about what the Buddhist teachings tell us about the construct of self, and how those perspectives can support us as we look at these ecological crises and climate chaos that are unfolding on this planetary scale. So when she starts off, she talks about this planet, this crisis, that's, whether it's from its military, ecological, or social aspect, derives from a dysfunctional and pathological notion of the self. So that starts off that this way, this focus on who we think we are, has this pathos in it, that there's something that is almost destructive when we think about the self. And then she says, it derives from a mistake about our place in the order of things. And one of the things that I think is that the essence of here is how in our society, especially in this society consumeristic, capitalistic, racial capitalistic society places humans at the top of the hierarchy, and certain humans then are even higher. And then nature is at our disposal for our use, for our enjoyment, however we would like to use it. And other species are seen as valuing less. And then we have laws that regulate, what happened when we do something, and they're inadequate to really support this sense of interconnection. They really support a sense of extraction. And so in Buddhism, we have intention towards non-harming. And so, for me, one of my aspects of non-harming is to really try as best as I can in my daily actions to think about the impact of what I'm doing, not only for myself, but for those that surround me, not only for just the humans that surround me and my family, also for the humans that surround me in the community, and then the plants and the animals. And so that I'm putting my impact of what I'm doing in this interconnected web. So it's not just like, oh, I want this, I'm going to get this. And so, if you have friends like I do, they already know that, if there's an ant or a fly or a mosquito in the vicinity, that I'm going to escort it out of the room and that I'm not going to kill it. And when I was working the schools and the kids, the students would always, they would know that I would be right over if they found a, spider or somebody in the room. I would be like, oh, there's my friend. Don't hurt my friend. And just that sense of like how we relate to the world around us is so often from a place of disconnect and protection and not from a place of interconnectedness. And so I'm encouraging us to use this frame of like, when we begin to think about ourselves in this place of hierarchy, can we bring our awareness to what that means in our bodies somatically? And can we bring our awareness to what it feels like when we feel in connection, whether it's with a tree or an animal or a friend or a family member? And then I love this aspect in Joanna's quote where she says, it is just a delusion that the self is so separate and fragile that we must delineate and defend its boundaries. This is something that I know that I grew up learning, that, I needed to defend myself, protect myself, care about myself, that people were out to get me, people were going to take advantage of me, that I really had to make sure that I was going to take care of myself. And this vision of mainstream culture where, like this, you're stepping on other people to get ahead, and there are those pictures where you're going up, the graph is going up and you're always getting more, you're getting better. And that is still, for so many of us in our families and our culture, that is success. And then when you get to the top, the thought is that that person has made it and that they are deserving, and even that they are, somehow are some extraordinary being, not of the wrath on the cultural and the impacts of on the earth of it. And so there really is no such thing as winners and losers. There's no such thing as this separation between us. And this fragility that we can have of ourselves, where we have to get walls around us and protection, keeps us from operating in a manner understanding of how connected we are. Now, those of you who have studied Buddhism know that the Buddha actually refused to answer the question whether or not there was such a thing as the self. When the Buddha was asked, is there a self? The Buddha didn't respond. When the Buddha was asked, is there not a self? The Buddha didn't respond. So the Buddha never said there is no There is not a self. The term that many people are familiar with in Buddhism is called anatta, anatta, and it's thought of as not self, or so it's that there's no, so it's one of these koan type things, that there's this in between kind of thing where there's no enduring self. And so that to say there is a self takes us out of this flow of who we are in the world, this self as a verb. And so that we consider the self as just constructed out of all these different processes, and that we're changing. We're in this process of change. And so this is where this sense of interconnectedness that Thich Nhat Hanh names as interbeing is one of the ways that we can think of this sense of anatta, of that where is it that I end and that you begin. I mean, there really is a place where I end and you begin. And on the other level where like this, where the skin is becoming dust in the air and all of those things, there isn't an end to that. But by holding on to this sense of separation, we create a distance and a disconnect. And then there's a place in our culture where we are in transactions where we have to hold on to and protect. And then we set up an us and a them, you, me. And then there's this way that we can engage in this sense of fragility, where we can then feel as though if we aren't protected, we're going to fall down. Bell Hooks talks about how society sets us up in this way. And she says, dominator culture has tried to keep us all afraid, to make us choose safety instead of risk, sameness instead of diversity. Moving through that fear, finding out what connects us, reveling in our differences, this is the process that brings us closer, that gives us a world of shared values, of meaningful community. Let me read that again. Dominator culture, which is what she calls the dominant culture, which I think is such an apt way of wording that. Dominator culture has tried to keep us all afraid. And so when we think of ourselves as small and fragile, then that sense of fear can arise. And then there's a sense of, oh, I need to protect. And so there is part of the culture that is the conditioning of the culture, especially for those of us who may feel marginalized because of our gender or our race or our sexuality or our body size or economics. All of those things can make us feel afraid. And then the message is to choose safety instead of risk, that risk of connection or the risk of not protecting, and the sameness instead of diversity. I've heard recently from some friends of even experiencing this sense of sameness, and I know it happens in all groups. Like even within the queer community, there can be a way that we can say, oh, if you are not this type of queer, or you're not representing gender in this way, this sameness, this sense of like, oh, you're like me, I feel safe. And so there's a way we can, even without intentionally wanting to, can reinforce this sense of sameness as safety. But if we look at the ecological perspective, we can see how significant it is for us to have diversity. And Bell Hooks says, moving through that fear, finding out what connects us, reveling in our differences, this is the process that brings us closer, that gives us a world of shared values, of meaningful community. And I love that she focuses on community as a way to feel safe. And I know for me, as someone who's introverted and kind of like, we'll spend time in nature, and nature is definitely a community for me, that sometimes it is hard to reach out to others. And yet I know that ultimately that sense of interconnectedness and relational, behavior and community is where safety is. I mean, I can still get my water and have my canned goods in case of an emergency. And yet, community is where we'll be supported. And so, let me read the next part of this quote that she talks about after we talk about the fragile part. She says that we must delineate and defend its boundaries, that it is so small and so needy that we must endlessly acquire and endlessly consume. Just reading this, I can just feel this sadness in my body, this way that we try to feed ourselves on this level of acquiring and consuming. And for some of us, it's keeping busy. For some of us, it may be, getting the next X, Y, or Z. For some of us, it may be whatever it is, that sense of it you can see, and that sense of what the Buddha talks about, that need towards greed and wanting. In this place of disconnect with others, when we're not as constant community or with the natural world, we can feel this lack and then look to something to provide something to fill that lack. And then there can become this endless cycle of just wanting. I mean, I know, like, my car, I have an old Prius, so like, one of those like not cool stickers on it. No, I don't, but just kidding. But anyhow, and so like I have really been like craving recently like a new car. And so I drive around and I just see my eyes go. It's just like this hooked. I get hooked to these cars that I want, that has high clearance so I can go out into the forest, like consuming lots of petroleum, right? And I can just feel myself be like, ooh, so-and-so down the street got a new car. I can just feel my whole energy, and that I can be like, have these whole little fantasies of seeing a car and thinking, what would it be like if I had that new car? And all of these things. And I can just see this play out, even though I know I'm not getting a new car. And even though I know that that car is not going to bring me happiness, I want a new car. I don't want to be sitting in this old car. And it's really amazing to watch this capacity of the mind that thinks that if I get that thing, that's going to bring me happiness. And it's this endless cycle. And luckily, at least, like once we use our mindfulness, when we begin to see it, we can just be like, oh, right, there it is again. That car thing thought that's gonna be what brings me happiness. And so that this endlessly consuming. And so in this sense of connection that the Buddha calls us into, this interconnectedness, the sense of anatta that suggests that it's not the only perspective, that there's a deeper truth of connection. And I love to remember that on the night of the enlightenment, the Buddha, there's a point where the Buddha reaches down and touches the earth, because the embodiment of evil in the story, as it goes, in Mara, says, who do you think you are that you can be awakened? Who will believe you? And the Buddha put their hand on the earth and said, as the earth is my witness, I know that I can be enlightened, something like that. That's my interpretation. And so I love that. I just love that connection, that rootedness in the earth, and that sense of connectedness of like, I know that, the earth is my witness. And for me, this is also just something that I feel so much support from, of when I'm challenged or confused, that I can gain a lot of clarity by spending time in the natural world, or even just going outside and gazing up at the clouds. And this afternoon, there were so many crows in the neighbor's tree, because it's right next to where the walnuts are. And if you have any walnut trees in your neighborhood right now, the crows are all over them because the walnuts are getting ripe, and then they're just dropping them on the ground. And so even just remember the interconnectedness with that neighbors of the crows that I have. And then so when I hear about and I engage in that, I can see this connection with the forces of the world, which are beyond this one here, beyond this self. And so this sense of I can protect this self almost begins to think like, am I not nature? I am of this nature to grow old. I am of the nature to get sick, just as trees get sick, just as crows get sick, just as all of these things. I am part of that nature and also connected to it. And so there's this whole unknown, there's this whole mystery, this sacred mystery of the systems and the interconnectedness of us all that engages with each other. And so there can be sometimes when I can let go into that beauty of the natural world, feel that same kind of letting go in myself and not prejudging what it means that my body is engaged in this process as well. And at the end of the quote, Joanna Macy says, "We create a self that is so aloof that as individuals, corporations, nation states, or species, we can be immune to what we do to other beings." This sense of being immunity, that we can operate without understanding the impact of our actions on others, is so rampant in our culture. And Buddhism really puts this front and center, this act of non-harming. The first of the training principles or the precepts is to refrain from harming. And so really feeling this sense of interconnection keeps us from this aloofness. And we can begin to see, as we practice our mindfulness, that we can begin to see this flow of the world and be more aware of the impacts of our actions on others and on the planet. One of the practices that Thich Nhat Hanh invites into in the order of interbeing, which he has, is the practice of touching the earth. And there's this whole ceremony of touching the earth, and I participated in it at one point, and it was just such a beautiful thing. And those people who were able to could actually prostrate. And when I did it a couple of years ago, we were in a redwood grove and outside of Santa Cruz, and it was really just so powerful to really feel the whole body physically touching the earth, and this invitation to touch the earth. And just to summarize what that practice is, she says, the practice of touching the earth is to return to the earth, to our roots, to our ancestors, and to recognize that we are not alone, but connected to a whole stream of spiritual and blood ancestors. We are their continuation, and with them will continue into future generations. We touch the earth to let go of the idea that we are separate and to remind us that we are the earth and part of life. This sense of ourselves connected in this stream of ancestors into the future is also part of indigenous wisdom as well. And so much of the capitalistic transactional is just, this we get this, and then we throw it away. We get this, and then it gets used and we throw it away. And there's not that sense of reaching into the past and into the future. And sometimes when we reach into the past, we really have to grapple with the impact and the horror and the violence of what has been perpetuated in our name. And we can also heal that. We can heal that in ourselves, and we can heal that in our communities. And so as we touch the earth, we can connect to the earth and to all beings and to this history of ourselves from the past going into the future, and remember that as we act and engage in our society. So I want to end with this quote by Grace Lee Boggs, who many of you know as activist, lived in Detroit, and just, if you haven't seen her documentary on her, it's really amazing. And she says, "I've come to believe that you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. I've come to believe that you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it." This invitation to step into the belonging and the responsibility and participation with each other in community, rather than this sense of a shrinking of the small, separate self, is such a beautiful invitation for all of us. Like, how do we take our practice and enliven it and engage with it, with the earth, with all beings, in whatever place we are and whatever that looks like for us, and creating that sense of belonging. So thank you for your kind attention.